Daughter dropped her 3 kids on my porch 11 years ago, said she'd be back before the casserole got cold, and then she just drove off into the dark and didn't come back. I raised them. I packed their lunches and learned how to braid hair off a YouTube video at 61 years old and sat up nights when the fevers came. And then, on a Thursday morning last spring, while I was scraping burnt grits off a skillet, the front door of my house came off its hinges, and a county deputy put his knee in my spine and told me I was under arrest for kidnapping the very children I'd been keeping alive. They figured I was a broke-down old man who'd cave the second they raised their voices. What they didn't know was that I had a manila envelope taped to the underside of a dresser drawer, and inside it was the one thing that could turn their whole circus inside out. When I finally laid that envelope on the judge's bench 3 weeks later, he went pale as a bedsheet and asked me, real quiet, "Do those children know what's in here?" And I looked him dead in the eye and told him the truth. Not yet, but they're going to. If you've ever loved somebody who turned around and tried to bury you, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. And tell me down in the comments what town you're listening from. It helps an old man know his voice carries past these mountains. Now let me tell you how it happened. My name's Calvin Pruitt. I'm 68 years old, and I spent 31 years running freight locomotives through the hollows of southern West Virginia, hauling coal out of the same mountains my daddy dug it from. Railroad work gives you 2 gifts and takes everything else. It gives you a back that aches when the barometer drops, and it gives you the kind of patience that comes from waiting on a signal that won't change for an hour. I retired with a pension that runs about $2,200 a month, and with my Social Security on top, I get by. Not pretty, but by. That morning started ordinary. I was in the kitchen of the little 2-bedroom on Sycamore Hollow Road, the house I've owned outright since 1998, frying eggs the way my youngest grandson likes them, over hard so the yolk don't run, because Eli's got a thing about runny eggs. Eli's 13 now. He was 11 months old when his mama set his car seat down on my porch and looked at me like I was a stranger. The 2 older ones were still asleep down the hall. Wyatt's 18, plays right tackle for the county high school, eats like he's storing up for winter. Nora's 16, smart as a whip, keeps a binder of college brochures under her bed like they're $100 bills. I was figuring my grocery budget in my head. I had about $40 of slack that week, and I'd been squirreling it away in a coffee can on top of the refrigerator to buy Wyatt a pair of cleats for the spring scrimmage, when I heard tires on the gravel. More than one car. I remember setting down the spatula. I remember the smell of the bacon starting to go past brown. And then the door didn't get knocked on. It got hit. Wood splintered into the front room, and 3 men in county uniforms came through it shouting so loud I couldn't make out a single word. Just noise. Just men, yelling at an old man in his own kitchen. I'm slow, but I ain't stupid. My first thought wasn't for me. It was for the hallway, for the kids. I took 1 step toward them, and a hand grabbed my collar, and another swept my feet, and I went down on the linoleum hard enough to chip a tooth. My cheek was pressed flat to the floor, an inch from a curl of bacon grease, and I could hear my heart going like a hammer on a rail spike. There's children in this house, I kept saying. Don't you scare those children. There's children sleeping right there. A knee came down between my shoulder blades, and the cuffs bit my wrists, and I heard Nora scream from down the hall, and I heard Eli start to cry, that high, thin sound he's made since he was a baby, and something in my chest just about tore loose. Then I heard Wyatt. Get off him! My brave, dumb, beautiful boy came barreling out of his room in his gym shorts, ready to fight 3 grown men with his bare hands, and I twisted my neck and screamed at him to stop, to stay back, to not give them a reason. 2 of them pinned him against the wall. He's 18, near 300 pounds, and they had him like he was a kid. He ain't done nothing, I said into the floor. Please. He's a boy. And that's when the room went quiet, and the uniforms parted, and she walked in. 11 years I hadn't laid eyes on my daughter. Last time I had, she'd weighed maybe 100 pounds with rocks in her pockets. Gray-skinned. A sore at the corner of her mouth, she kept worrying with her tongue. A man with prison ink up his neck idling a primer-spotted Camaro at the end of my drive. The woman who walked into my kitchen that morning could have stepped off a magazine in a doctor's waiting room. Cream-colored coat. Hair the color of butter, blown out smooth. Sunglasses she slid down slow to show me eyes done up in makeup that didn't run. She looked rich. She looked rested. And she looked at me lying cuffed on my own floor like I was something she'd scrape off her shoe. "That's him," she said, and pointed one painted nail at me, and her voice went up loud and shaky for the benefit of everybody in the room. "That's the man who took my babies. That's him, officers. 11 years I'd been searching." I lay there with my face on the cold floor, and I could not make my mouth work. Searching. She hadn't searched for a thing but a hairdresser. She'd dumped 3 crying children in my front room and told me she was going for diapers, and then she'd gone to wherever it is people go when they decide their own blood is too heavy to carry. And now here she was, weeping with no tears, calling me a thief. She rushed down the hall toward the kids, arms out, the whole performance. "My darlings, Mama found you. Mama never stopped looking." I couldn't see them, but I could feel it, the way the air in a house changes when the people you love are afraid. Eli didn't know who she was. He'd never seen her face, except in one cracked photograph I kept in a drawer, and even that I'd thought about throwing out 100 times. He shrank back from the strange, perfumed woman wailing his name. Nora put herself between this woman and her little brother. I heard her say in a voice that was trying so hard to be steady, "Who are you? Get away from him." They walked me out, past my own torn-up door in my undershirt, barefoot, hands behind my back, while the whole holler watched from their porches. Old man Tackett across the road had his coffee cup halfway to his mouth, frozen. The Abernathy woman, 2 doors down, had her hand over her mouth. I'd plowed her driveway free of charge every winter for 9 years. These were people who knew me, people who'd watched me walk those 3 kids to the bus stop in the rain, and not one of them could do a thing but stand there while the law hauled me off like I was the worst kind of monster. I spent that first night in the county lockup. They gave me a bologna sandwich and a paper cup of water and a holding cell that smelled like 100 years of other men's bad nights. I didn't sleep. I sat on the metal bench and I tried to understand it. Why now? Why like this? Why the broken door, the men with guns for a 70-pound difference of opinion about custody? It was my friend Buck who started putting it together. Buck Lattimore and I came up together, fired the same boilers back when the engines still ran steam on the museum line. He's 66, a widower, lives out past the quarry in a single wide, with a dog named Diesel and a porch full of engine parts he swears he's going to use someday. Buck's the kind of man the world stopped making. He showed up at the courthouse the next morning with a bail bondsman and $4,000 he pulled out of his sock, which I know for a fact was most of what he had, and he didn't say a word about it then, and he won't to this day. They let me out on bond with conditions that made me sick, a restraining order. 500 yards from my own grandchildren. No contact, none. Not a phone call. Not a note. Surrender of the old single-shot .22 I used on groundhogs in the garden, which they made sound, in the paperwork, like an arsenal. I signed it all because the alternative was a cell, and I figured I was no use to those kids from a cell. Buck drove me home in his truck. We didn't talk much. When we pulled up to my busted door, he finally said, "Cal, a woman who can't be bothered to send a birthday card for 11 years don't come back with a lawyer and a SWAT team for a hug." He chewed on that a second. Somebody's paying for all this. That coat. That lawyer. Whoever's paying ain't doing it out of love, so what's it about? It took us 2 days and a man Buck knew who used to do paralegal work before the bottle got him, but we found it. The children's father, a man named Marcus Vale, who'd never paid a dime, never sent a card, who I'd met exactly twice, had died 4 months back. Single-car wreck on a wet road outside Charleston. And Marcus Vale, it turned out, had not been the deadbeat I'd taken him for. He'd come from money. Real money. The kind that owns mineral rights and doesn't talk about it. There was a trust. A big one. And a wrongful death settlement on top of it from the trucking company whose driver had crossed the line. All told, near $4 million, and every cent of it belonged to those 3 children, locked up tight until each one turned 25. But there was a clause. There's always a clause. Whoever held legal custody of the kids got named guardian of the estate, and the guardian drew a stipend, a salary, for the care and management of the beneficiaries. $200,000 a year, plus a housing allowance, plus discretionary draws that a slick enough lawyer could stretch like taffy. I sat there at my kitchen table with the photocopies Buck's friend had dug up, and the whole rotten thing came clear. My daughter hadn't come back for her babies. She'd come back for a paycheck, 200 grand a year for as long as she could keep custody, and a lawyer named Pierce Wexler, who I came to understand, took a cut of everything he touched. The probate hearing to name the permanent guardian and unlock the money was set for 3 weeks out, and here was the thing that made my blood run backward. If I walked into that hearing as the man who'd raised them for 11 years, any honest judge in this state would have laughed her out of the building. Abandonment. But a kidnapper doesn't get custody. A felon doesn't manage a $4 million trust. She didn't need to beat me. She needed to erase me. That's why the broken door. That's why the made-up stories. She needed me to be a monster so she could play the saint. And if I was sitting in a cell on the day of that hearing, she'd walk in unopposed and collect. They're paydays to her, I said to Buck. Wyatt. Nora. Eli. She looks at my grandbabies and she sees a check. That afternoon, the phone on my wall rang. The landline, the one I only keep because the cell signal dies in a hard rain. I about jumped out of my skin. I picked it up and there was static and breathing, and then the smallest voice, Grandpa. It was Wyatt whispering. He'd talked a maid at the hotel into letting him use her phone. They were downtown at the Marriott, locked in a suite with the door guarded by a man Wexler had hired. She'd taken their phones. She'd taken Nora's rescue inhaler because, Wyatt said, his voice breaking. She said it looked bad in the pictures. She had a stylist come in to dress them up for some kind of photographs. She was talking on the phone all day about money and lawyers and a school in Vermont, a boarding school, and Wyatt had heard her say the word permanent. Grandpa, she keeps saying you're going to prison forever, he whispered. She keeps telling Eli you took us. He's starting to look at me funny, like maybe it's true. I don't know how to tell him. I gripped that phone so hard the plastic creaked. You listen to me, I said. You are 18 years old. In the eyes of the law, you can speak for yourself now. Do you hear me? You don't belong to anybody. You remember everything she says. You write it down if you can. And you keep Eli close, and you tell Nora I love her, and you tell her to breathe slow. I am not going to prison. I'm coming. I don't know how yet, but I'm coming. I heard a door rattle, and a woman's voice sharp as a blade asking who he was talking to, and the line went dead. I won't pretend the next part was clean. There's a version of this where the old man waits patient for the system to work, but I knew that hotel had a checkout date, and I knew that lawyer had a flight boat, because Buck's friend had seen it. A boarding school in Vermont meant out of state, out of jurisdiction, and once those kids crossed a state line into a school that lawyer had picked and paid for, the courts could chew on it for years, and Eli would grow up believing his grandpa was the man who stole his childhood. I couldn't carry that. I promised a baby in a dirty car seat 11 years ago that he would never be anybody's burden, and I meant to keep it. Now, I want to be careful here, because I broke a court order, and I'm not proud of it, and I won't dress it up. I didn't take a gun. I didn't take a tire iron. I took Buck, and I took Nora's spare inhaler out of the medicine cabinet, the one I'd kept for emergencies, because that detail mattered more to me than anything. We drove to that hotel in Buck's old Ford with the muffler held on by wire, and I walked into a marble lobby in my good flannel shirt and my work boots, and I told the front desk I was Calvin Pruitt, and I had a granddaughter upstairs who could die without the medicine in my pocket. They called security. Of course they did. 2 big men in cheap suits came down and tried to walk me back out the doors, and one of them put a hand on my chest, and I'll tell you, that's the closest I came to doing something I'd regret. But before it went anywhere, the elevator opened and Wyatt was there. He'd seen Buck's truck from the window. He had Eli by the hand and Nora behind him, and Nora was wheezing. That dry whistle in her chest, and the second she saw me, her face just came apart. Eli stopped dead. He looked at me, and he looked at the security men holding my arms, and you could see him trying to make the picture match the story his mother had been pouring into his ears. And then he yanked his hand out of Wyatt's, and he ran across that lobby and hit me in the stomach so hard I lost my breath. His face buried in my shirt, and he was saying, "Grandpa, Grandpa, Grandpa," like it was the only word he knew. I got the inhaler to Nora. Buck stood between us and the security men like a fence post that wouldn't move, and that's the picture the lobby cameras caught. An old man holding 3 crying kids who were trying to climb into his arms, and a hotel full of strangers watching, and a couple of bewildered guards who didn't know what to do with a reunion. It is the single most important thing that happened in this whole story, and I didn't even know it at the time. The deputies came. My daughter came down screaming about the restraining order, about her babies, the whole performance. But it played different in a public lobby full of witnesses than it had in my kitchen. They arrested me again. They put the cuffs back on in front of the kids, which I hated, and Wyatt was yelling that I hadn't done anything, that we'd come on our own, and Nora was holding the inhaler up like evidence. They added charges: violating the order, trespass, a few other things the lawyer cooked up to make it look 10 times worse than an old man delivering asthma medicine. The DA started talking about real time. They put me back in that cell, and I'll be honest with you, I cracked a little. I sat there and I thought, I've made it worse. I've handed her the monster she needed. And then, somewhere around 3 a.m, listening to a man 2 cells down talk to people who weren't there, I remembered the dresser. 11 years back, the night before she drove off for the last time, my daughter had needed money. She always needed money. And she'd had something I wanted more than I'd ever wanted anything, which was the legal right to keep those children safe from her. So we'd done a thing that wasn't strictly a thing you can do, a homemade document. But I'd been careful. I'd driven her to a notary I knew, a woman named Ruth who ran an insurance office out on Route 9. And I'd had my daughter write out in her own hand, and sign, and have stamped and dated exactly what she was agreeing to. I taped it inside a manila envelope to the underside of my bottom dresser drawer, and I'd prayed every day for 11 years that I'd never have to use it, because I knew what it would do to the kids to read it. But it was there. The deputies who tore my house apart looking for a dungeon in a gun rack never thought to pull out a drawer. I needed 2 things. I needed somebody to go get that envelope, and I needed to fire the public defender they'd assigned me, a sweating young man who kept telling me to take a plea and apologize. Buck got the envelope. He drove out to my place in the dark and climbed through the laundry room window I'd told him about, and he got it, and on his way out he tripped over a porch step and split his shin open on the rail, and there's a smear of his blood dried on the corner of that envelope to this day. He carried it into that courthouse like he was carrying a live coal. Now here's where it could have gone the way of every cheap story, where the system's all rigged and the only way out is some wild stunt. But it didn't go that way, and I think that matters, so I'll tell it straight. There was a CPS caseworker, a no-nonsense woman named Ms. Cordell, and the law in this state required her to interview the children, and to her everlasting credit, she did her job. She sat down with each of those kids alone, the way you're supposed to, and she asked them open questions, and she wrote down what they said. And what they said was 11 years of truth. Wyatt told her about learning to drive in my truck, and me at every one of his games. Nora told her about the binder of colleges and me staying up to quiz her for the SATs. Eli told her his grandpa makes his eggs over hard, and there's a man named Buck who taught him to fish. And when she asked them about their mother, there was a long quiet, and then Wyatt, who is 18 and could speak for himself, said the thing that the whole case turned on. He said, I remember her leaving. I was 7. I remember her saying we weren't her problem anymore. A 7-year-old's memory, 11 years old now, written down in an official report. And the neighbors came forward. Every last one who'd stood frozen on their porches the morning of the raid showed up to that courthouse, because it turns out people aren't cowards forever. They just need a minute to find their feet. The Abernathy woman, Old Man Tackett, the bus driver, the kid's pediatrician with 11 years of well-child visits and a folder, the high school principal, the youth pastor. My daughter's lawyer had paid a man named Hargis who lived down the road to say he'd heard screaming from my house at night. He got up on that stand and lied, and he did it for what I later learned was the forgiveness of a gambling debt. But you can buy one man. You can't buy a whole holler. When my turn came and the lawyer tried to make Hargis's story stick, the principal of the high school stood up in the gallery, uninvited, and the judge let her speak. And she said in front of God and everybody that those 3 children were among the most cared-for kids in her school, and that the man who raised them had never missed a parent-teacher conference in 11 years. You don't get that from a monster. But none of it would have been enough. A good lawyer can muddy good people. What it came down to, in the end, was the envelope. I fired the public defender. The judge, a flinty old man named Ferris, who'd clearly already made up his mind about me from the newspapers, warned me 3 times that I was a fool to represent myself. I told him he was probably right and that I was going to do it anyway. And when he asked me to call my first witness, I stood up, and my ankle chains rattled in that quiet room, and I said I didn't have a witness. I had a piece of paper. I walked it up to the bench. My daughter was at the plaintiff's table, dressed down now in a gray cardigan 2 sizes too big, hair in a plain bun, dabbing in eyes that weren't wet, the very picture of a grieving mother, and Pierce Wexler beside her in a suit that cost more than my truck, looking smug as a cat in cream. But when I pulled that manila envelope out, dirt-stained, blood-smeared, 11 years old, I watched my daughter's face change. I watched her stop pretending to cry. She knew that envelope. You don't forget the color of the day you sold your own children. I opened it in front of everybody, and the tearing of the paper was the only sound in that room. Inside was a single sheet of lined notebook paper, the kind you buy 3 for $1, her handwriting on it. The official stamp of Ruth's notary seal in the corner, dated, and I read it out loud, and my voice did not shake, because I wasn't scared anymore. I was just tired and right. She'd written that she gave up all parental rights to Wyatt, Nora, and Eli, permanent and final. To me, Calvin Pruitt. That she agreed never to contact them again, and that in exchange she accepted the sum of $9,000 in cash, which she stated in her own hand was for the down payment on a used Corvette and a fresh start in Florida. She signed her name under it. $9,000. That was the price. 3 children for the down payment on a sports car. I'd love to tell you the courtroom gasped, but it was worse than a gasp. It was a silence with weight to it, the kind that presses on your ears. The court reporter's hands came off her keys, and then I reached back in the envelope and I pulled out the last thing, the thing I'd debated my whole life over whether to keep. A photograph. She'd had a friend snap it the day she bought the car, and somehow it had ended up in my hands years ago, and I'd never had the stomach to destroy it. In the picture, she's leaning on a red Corvette in a parking lot, sunglasses on, a fan of cash in one hand, grinning like she'd won the lottery. And on the hot pavement beside the car, in the corner of the frame, out of focus but there, plain as anything, is a baby carrier. Eli, 11 months old, sat down on the blacktop in the August sun while his mother posed with her money. I laid the paper and the photo on Judge Ferris's bench. I watched a man who'd spent 30 years on that bench, who'd surely seen every awful thing one person can do to another, go absolutely white. His hand shook when he picked up the photograph. He looked at it, and he looked at her, and he looked at her again, and something in his face that had been set against me from the start just fell away. Across the room, Pierce Wexler closed his folder and slid his chair an inch from his client like he might catch what she had. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was low and even and terrible. He didn't look at the lawyers. He looked at her. He said he'd never in his career seen a clearer case of a parent who'd forfeited every right she ever had, and that he was referring the matter, the abandonment, the perjured witness, the fraudulent petition to seize a trust, to the prosecutor's office for charges. He dismissed every count against me from the bench. And then he asked me that question, the one I told you about at the start. He held up the envelope and he asked real quiet, "Do those children know about this?" And I told him, not yet, but they were going to. Because they deserved the truth from somebody who loved them and not a lie from somebody who didn't. It wasn't quick after that. The way these things never are. There were months of paperwork. The state granted me permanent custody, which on paper I'd had a homemade version of all along. The trust got handed to a firm of strangers in suits, and I'll tell you what I did the first day I had the say-so. I fired them. Every manager and lawyer who'd been so eager to help my daughter raid that account, I cleaned them all out, and I moved the money to a quiet, boring outfit run by a woman who'd grown up 2 counties over and whose handshake meant something. I set it up so that I myself could not touch the children's principal, not a dollar. That money is for college, for first houses, for the lives those kids are going to build. I took the small guardian stipend the court allowed me, and I did not buy a thing for myself with it. The first thing I did with it was Buck. He'd put up his last $4,000 and climbed through a window at 66 and bled on the one piece of paper that saved us all, and he'd never once asked for a thing. I paid off the lien on his land. I bought him a new transmission for that Ford, so the muffler could finally rest in peace, and a kennel and a year of good food for Diesel, and I told him there was a guest room in my house, with his name on it for as long as he drew breath. He cussed me out for 10 solid minutes and then he cried. We don't talk about that part. My daughter took a plea on the fraud and the abandonment and the rest. She did some time. The lawyer, Pierce Wexler, lost his license and most of his clients, and I hear he's selling something now, somewhere far from here. The man Hargis who lied on the stand had to answer for it too. The whole rotten thing came apart, the way rotten things do when you finally drag them into the light. I told the kids the truth, all of it, the way I'd promised the judge. I waited until Eli was old enough to hold it, and I sat the three of them down at the same kitchen table where I'd been arrested, and I let them read the paper in their mother's own hand. Wyatt got quiet, Nora cried, and then got angry, and then got quiet too. Eli looked at the photograph of himself on that pavement for a long time, and then he folded it back up and he handed it to me, and he said, "You came and got me, though." And I said yes. And he said, "Then I don't care about the rest of it." 13 years old and wiser than the woman who bore him. I still own the little house on Sycamore Hollow Road, but we don't spend every night there anymore. With a piece of the stipend, I bought myself the one foolish thing I dreamed about since I was a young man, hanging off the side of a locomotive. A used motorhome. A big diesel pusher with a bad paint job and a good engine. Buck helped me get her running right. And in the summers when school lets out, the four of us, and sometimes five when Buck comes along, point her west and we just go. We've seen the Smokies turn blue at dusk, and the corn run flat to the edge of the world in Kansas, and the red rocks out past Moab that don't look like they belong on this earth. Right now, as I'm telling you this, I'm sitting in a folding chair outside that motorhome at a campground in the high desert, and the sun's going down the color of a struck match. Eli's burning marshmallows on purpose because he likes them charred. Wyatt's got a college acceptance letter folded in his wallet that he keeps taking out to look at. Nora's reading by the fire with her feet up on a cooler, peaceful in a way she wasn't for a lot of years. Buck's telling some lie about a fish. I'll tell you what I learned, and then I'll let you go. People say blood is thicker than water, like it settles something. They use it to make you forgive people who'd watch you drown. But blood is just chemistry. It's just the accident of who you came from. My daughter shared my blood, and she set her own baby down on hot pavement and posed for a picture. Blood didn't make her my family. And the man asleep in the back of this motorhome, who isn't kin to me by a single drop, who gave his last $4,000 and climbed through a window in the dark for children that aren't even his, that man is more my family than she ever was. Family isn't who made you. Family is who stays. Family is who climbs through the window. Family is who comes and gets you. My daughter sold 3 children for the down payment on a car, and she'll spend the rest of her days knowing she's worth less than the people she threw away. Me, I've got a dented motorhome and a bad back and $4 million I'll never spend a nickel of, and I sleep every night within arm's reach of everybody on this earth I love. I made the right deal. I'd make it again 1,000 times. And if you're out there tonight wondering whether the ones who left you were ever really yours, let me save you the trouble. They weren't. Your family is already here. Your family is whoever's still sitting by your fire when the sun goes down. I've turned that morning over in my head 1,000 times. The broken door, the knee in my back, and I keep landing on the same hard truth. Nothing in this life comes from nowhere. My daughter didn't break that door down out of love. She broke it down because 11 years earlier she'd made a choice, and choices are seeds, and seeds grow into exactly what they are. She set a baby down on hot pavement for the down payment on a Corvette, and a decade later that same coldness came back wearing a cream-colored coat and called itself a mother. You can put a nice coat on a thing, but you can't change what it is underneath. The pavement always remembers, and what saved us wasn't luck, though I prayed it was. It was 3 things I'd built without knowing I was building them. The first was that I never once cut a corner on those kids when nobody was watching, never lied, never raised a hand, never gave the town a single true bad word to say about me. Because when Bridget's lawyer tried to buy a false story, a whole holler stood up and told the truth instead. You spend years being a straight man, and then one day that straightness walks into a courtroom and stands up for you when you can't stand up for yourself. The second was that I thought ahead. The night I made Bridget sign that paper in front of a notary, some quiet part of me knew she might come back someday, and I planned for the worst even while I hoped for the best. That cold piece of foresight, taped under a drawer for 11 years, is the only reason I'm not dying in a cell right now. And the third was that I just would not quit. I was 70-pound broke and chained to a hospital bed, and they buried me under charges, and I still found one more card to play. because giving up was the one thing I never learned how to do on those rigs and rails. So if you take anything from an old man tonight, take this. Be the kind of person whose word holds, because someday your good name will be the only lawyer you've got. Think a few moves further than feels comfortable, because the people who love you deserve a plan, and not just a hope. And when the door comes off the hinges, when the whole world calls you the villain, do not lay down. Wyatt didn't lay down. Buck didn't lay down. Little Eli ran across a marble lobby and grabbed hold of me like he was never letting go, and that boy taught me more about courage than I taught him. Bridget chose money, and money left her alone. I chose them, and look what I've got. Family was never about whose blood you carry. It's about who stays when the storm comes, and who comes and gets you when you can't get to yourself.